This is Open Mind Alexander technique. Today we are looking at the whispered ah, which is a Alexander technique breathing procedure or breathing experiment, breathing exercise that I find can be really helpful for students who are working with breath availability and wanting also a way to check in with how can they notice something that helps them self-regulate. So a multi-purpose activity here. Whispered ah comes from way back in the Alexander technique history. This is something that was worked on well over 100 years ago originally. There are some specific instructions and directions that people use kind of traditionally or classically, if you want to think of it that way, with whispered ah. And there's also kind of adaptations and other ways that you can use it. The basic premise here is saying ah on a whisper until you get to the bottom of your breath, and then allowing your own springiness in your rib cage to be what prompts your inhale. So the real purpose here is what happens at the bottom of the breath. It's not trying to force out as much air as possible. It's not trying to fill up as much as possible. We're not aiming for huge extremes or increasing breath. What we're aiming for is ease and a smooth, springy turnover between an exhale to an inhale. I've got our friend Stan here so that I can gesture a little bit to what he's doing. So when we go to whisper on an ah, the jaw will drop. If we don't drop on an ah, you end up with a ah versus ah here. Go ahead and try that a couple times, just opening your mouth and saying ah, pretty closed teeth versus open teeth. Ah, ah, ah. Ah. You might notice some differences around your jaw and your ears and maybe even the back of your neck. Why that is comes from the proximity that we're dealing with here. So here's the jaw. This hole here is your ear canal right there. So that's where the auditory nerve goes in. That's where you can stick your fingers in your ears. That's where that is. And then your neck is right next to it as well. So the very top of your spine. This is all within about an inch of each other on most people. So everything that happens in this area tends to really influence the other aspects going on mechanically. So asking for ease in the jaw is very connected with asking for ease in the neck. And you might notice that around the kind of ear area, since that's where we're looking at here. So the jaw on me is right in front of my ear. There's that jaw movement. And then on me, my head to neck connection, just with how the outsides of my ears are shaped, is going to be around earlobe level. It's right about there on me. So when I'm facing Stan here, you can kind of get an idea of what I'm changing in my face compared to what he's doing with his mouth closed. His mouth can spring open, but I have to really pull on it, and it doesn't like doing that very much, and I'm a little worried that if you pull on it too much, the springs will give up. So we're just not going to ask him to open his mouth. So I'm going to demonstrate whispered ah sideways so you can see my jaw drop this way. I'm going to do a few facing forward, and you'll be able to hear my sound of a whispered ah noise. The reason that they chose a whisper is we tend to have fewer habits associated with whispering than we do with speaking or singing. I find this to be especially true of singers because the second they are singing, they will start doing their singing habits and fire off that program that says start singing, and that's going to hit everything. So if we break this apart a little bit and say, let's work on a type of, not quite vocalizing because the vocal folds aren't active in this case. Let's work with jaw dropping. Let's work with breath. Let's work with openness in the throat. Sometimes, after my students work with this a few times, the sound of the ah will actually change and get a little bit more resonant, a little bit more open sounding. So I'm going to start to the side and I'm going to do a couple whispered ah. So how did I do that? I opened my mouth, and as the air came out, I let that keep going and I allowed my rib cage to come back down again. I've got a couple of videos on rib cage movement and breath mechanics, so please go check that out if you're interested. We're not going to dig into that too much today. So as those ribs come back down and in again on my exhale, I will feel my rib cage moving. I'll feel my back moving, I'll feel my front moving. Breath is movement. So if I'm trying to hold myself out, it's not going to go well, and I'm not actually going to be able to get out as much air as I would like, because my bellows would be stuck open. And that's just not going to work very well mechanically. The ribs have to be able to come back down and in again. Then when I got to the bottom of my breath, I closed my mouth and I let air come back in through my nose. Now, your mileage may vary slightly on this one. There's a quote from ye old Mr. Alexander saying, under all reasonable circumstances, one should be able to breathe through their nose instead of their mouth. Well, okay, but you lived in London, which is sea level and humid. I'm in Denver, which is neither sea level nor humid. I am perpetually half congested here. It's very dry here. So I question whether Mr. Alexander would consider Denver to be a reasonable circumstance. So there's that. If I'm going to be doing a lot of breath work, and especially if I'm teaching whispered ah, I'm going to blow my nose beforehand, like at least twice, because that's going to go better. So breathing through your nose can have some challenges associated with it, but the positives of breathing through your nose, you end up with more moist air coming in through your throat, and so it helps your throat to not dry out if you're speaking or singing. Because when that air comes in, it's had time to go through your sinuses, your nasal passages. It'll also be a little bit more filtered from dust and other stuff in the air because of all of the hairs and this kind of filtration cleaning system that we've got in our noses and sinuses. The air will also be a little more adjusted to my body temperature by the time it gets to my voice. And I do notice a difference if I'm doing a lot of mouth inhale breath versus nose inhale breath. I do notice a difference on my voice in terms of just the ease and how often do I need to go take a sip of tea because I'm, dry and dusty kind of throat, because again, it's very dry here. So I'm going to do a couple more to the side. This time, what I would like you to watch is the angle of my jaw. So there you can see that my jaw actually really did have to drop and relax. As we've covered before in a video on jaw mechanics, TMJ stuff, where this comes from is all the way up to the side of your head, your temporal muscle, that goes down and attaches to the sides of the jaw, and then you also have, there's a couple other small ones in the jaw and the cheek in here, but the main two, temporal muscle coming down to here, and then the masseter, that's our main chewing muscle, between the cheekbone and the bottom of the jaw. So those are the two, and you might feel that kind of shift down the sides of your face, and it might be kind of a funny feeling in your ears if you're not used to that moving. So now I'm going to do a couple whispered ahs facing forward. Let's move Stan here. You can still see the comparison. Looking forward, you'll be able to see, again, my mouth and my jaw from the front, but you will also have a really great view of my shoulders. The key point here is that we are not trying to get the shoulders to rise on an inhale, but I'm also not trying to keep them forced down. Remember that muscles can only pull or release, they can't push. How do shoulders go up? It's a pull above in the neck. How do shoulders get pulled down? It's a pull down generally in the back and in the armpit area. Those are the two main ones. You can also pull slightly in the front. It kind of depends on if you're pulling more back or more front and down. But those are the main two options that you're going to see. So why is it, and I just did it just now as I took a breath to speak, why is it that shoulders rise during an inhale that is still easeful and I'm not pulling up or down? Because it rests on the rib cage. And as the rib cage goes up and out, all of these mid and upper ribs here will contribute to this system rising up. That pivot point is at the sternum to collarbones, so sternoclavicular. The clavicle is the scientific term for your collarbone. It's at your sternoclavicular joint here on this side. So it's got two of them on each side. So that whole system can pivot, and it's really important that it can move. Your first rib comes all the way up into the shoulder area. It's much higher than a lot of people think it is. So if I'm trying to hold my shoulders down, I'm actually preventing myself from getting a full breath. So here's what that looks like on me. I'm gonna make sure that you can see the sides of my ribs here. Did you notice my shoulders move? I bet they did. A few things to watch for. I recommend you do whispered ahs either in front of a camera, in front of a mirror. Watch and see what you're doing if you're not working with another person who can give you verbal feedback on what you're doing. Some very common habits that I see a lot with my students. The first most common one is when you get to the bottom half of the breath, they start to compress. So that would look like this. And trying to force down to get out the last little drops of breath out of the bottom. We're still thinking our directions. A direction is any helpful thought that helps you organize yourself. Some really common ones are up or lengthening. You can also think about connection, connecting your skull to your spine, this easy, soft, balanced connection throughout your whole torso tower, so that you're not compressing yourself as you're doing an activity like a whispered ah breath. Another one to check in with is the angle of my skull changing? So I'm going to show that from the side. It's a little bit easier to see. I'll move a stand for comparison as usual here. So watch the angle of cheekbones. That's going to be the main thing to look at. Make sure he's in frame here. So, if he'll stop moving. If I were to look straight ahead at Stan, and he's raised up a little bit from me, we're actually about the same height, but he's just on a stand, so his heels are about here, and then we are about the same height. So right now, dead eye level for me, dead straight eye level for me, is roughly Stan's chin, somewhere around there. If I pull in the back of my neck, that will pull my skull back and down, and I will end up more like here. Now I'm looking at Stan's teeth. This is his nose. This is the top of Stan's head. The other direction here, so now I'm resetting to Stan's chin. The other direction would be his sternum, the top of the sternum here, collarbone height. And now I'm looking at the bottom of his sternum down here. And you can actually kind of hear in my voice that now I'm starting to get a bit strained in my vocal folds. And I'm also feeling a bit of an overstretch in the back of my neck because I'm really asking those bones to stretch out on their back sides. So when I do my whispered ah, it's good practice to be able to learn where is my neutral head and neck balance? And can I allow jaw movement to be independent from neck tension? It's hard. These are very, very close to each other. This is going to take practice. This is not something that I expect people to just like walk in and I tell them the one key to life and then they're able to do it. This takes a lot of practice. So here's the difference. If I start to tighten in the back of my neck while doing a whispered ah, here's what it might look like. So my vision has shifted, and I'm now looking roughly at Stan's teeth to nose kind of area. And I've also come down a little bit and curled forward as part of that process. So my thoracic spine, my upper thoracic around here, my upper chest has dropped and curled forward. and I've gone the opposite direction in my neck. So I've basically increased an S shape into that system. So here's my upright normal, and here's where I ended up. A little more curled forward here and curled back above. When I go back to my whispered ah again, now I'm going to keep eye level, and I'm going to keep looking at Stan's chin. That stayed much more stable, and it's a way to practice the difference between jaw movement versus neck movement. You can also practice whispered ah in positions that are not completely upright. It's very useful, I find singers especially, to have them practice whispered ah in a bit of a bend. Now this is the same exact bend that we use for standing at the piano, standing over a desk. I have a lot of different videos on standing bending, so check those out if you haven't seen them. My standing bend is going to allow this whole torso tower to my head to tilt, and I will end up looking more down, which is very useful for being able to do something like find a pitch at the piano, or to be able to bend over and pick something up, bend over to write something down real quick. This whispered ah here I will feel a bit differently in my back because I'm organizing my back differently compared to gravity. I might also feel it a bit differently in my jaw because gravity will be taking my jaw more forward. So I highly recommend you practice both. I'm still asking for my neck to be free, easy, have my soft nestled connection in my spine to my head. As I go into my bend, I'm letting my arms go with gravity, so I'm not trying to pull my shoulders back or extend them forward. I'm just maintaining that soft connection in my shoulders, allowing my arms to take up whatever space they do, and my knees are soft, my knees are bent forward. So I've taken my pelvis back, my knees forward, tilted my torso tower, so I'm in this zigzag arrangement. And I can do a couple whispered ahs while I'm here. I was working on this a couple weeks ago with a cellist, and we found that the sound of the ah moving through his air passages was very different when he was in a bit of a bend versus upright. And so that gave us some information that when he was in a tilt, the way that he was organizing his neck and his throat were different than when he was vertical. And so then we got interested in that and used that to apply to his cello playing. When he's seated, he might be tilted slightly forward, and we can use that as a movement exploration to see, what are you doing when you're tilting forward? Are you pulling in your neck? Are you pulling in your shoulders? How does that impact your ability to work with the instrument? There's all sorts of interesting things that you can learn in a deliberately stylized activity like a whispered ah. So I encourage you to try a few whispered ahs. I wouldn't do more than maybe 3 or 4 at a time. It can lead to being a little bit over or under oxygenated, and then oxygenated, and you can get a little bit dizzy. So just keep an eye on that. Don't fall over. Give yourself time to breathe normally in between sets of whispered ahs, and see how a little bit more breath awareness can be helpful for you in your life.